age-old farm tradition.
The confrontation happened at the parts counter on a Tuesday morning in March 1981. Gerald Mitchell, age 46, walked into Benson Implement in Tama County, Iowa, needing hydraulic seals for his 1962 Farmall 560. The tractor was 19 years old, showing wear, but still reliable. Behind the counter stood Rick Benson, age 38, who'd taken over his father's John Deere dealership in 1976. Rick saw Gerald, saw the parts list, and couldn't help himself. "Gerald, how long are you going to keep sinking money into that old Farmall? That tractor is ancient. You're throwing good money after bad." Gerald was a quiet man, didn't like confrontation. "Just need the seals, Rick." "I'm serious. Look at what you're farming, 320 acres. You need modern equipment. I've got a 4440 on the lot right now. 3 years old, 2,100 hours, pristine condition. I can make you a deal." "Not interested." "Gerald, you're being a fool. That Farmall is costing you money every day. Inefficient, unreliable, outdated. You're leaving thousands on the table by not upgrading." Gerald looked at Rick directly. "How much is the 4440? $32,000. I'll give you $4,000 for your 560 as trade. Finance $28,000 at 13.5% over 7 years. Payment would be $495 a month. That's $5,940 a year. Investment, not expense. The 4440 will pay for itself in productivity gains. I'll take the seals." Rick rang up the parts, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake. That old Farmall is going to cost you your farm. I've seen it happen. Farmers who refuse to modernize get left behind. Mark my words, Gerald. In 5 years, you'll wish you'd listened to me." Gerald paid for the seals, left without responding. That conversation would have been forgotten except for what happened over the next 12 years. Gerald farmed his 320 acres with the 1962 Farmall 560, maintained it carefully. When something broke, he fixed it, avoided debt, lived simply, saved money. Rick Benson expanded aggressively. Between 1981 and 1989, he bought 3 neighboring farms totaling 480 acres. Financed at rates starting at 13.5% in 1981, climbing to 16.8% by 1983, staying high through the mid-80s. Total debt, $578,000 by 1985. The 1980s farm crisis hit. Land values crashed. Corn prices fell from 3.11 in 1980 to $2.10 by 1983. Rick's debt service was $89,400 annually. His gross income fell from $142,000 in 1981 to $96,000 by 1983. He couldn't cover payments. Rick tried everything. Sold equipment, cut expenses, borrowed more. Nothing worked. By 1990, he was 3 years behind on land payments. The bank started foreclosure. Gerald heard about it. Rick Benson, the man who'd called him a fool 9 years earlier, was losing everything. The dealership was gone, closed in 1988. The farms were being foreclosed. In March 1993, Rick's 480 acres went to auction. Gerald attended. He'd saved aggressively through the 80s, had $186,000 in cash. Land was selling for $950, $150 per acre. Gerald bid $980 per acre, won the auction, bought all 480 acres for $474, paid $186,000 cash down, financed $284,400 at 7.2% over 15 years. Now Gerald owned 800 acres. Rick owned nothing. 2 weeks after the auction, Gerald was at the co-op when Rick walked in. They'd avoided each other since the foreclosure. Now they were face to face. Rick looked at Gerald. "You bought my farm." "I bought the bank's farm. It wasn't yours anymore. 12 years ago, I told you that Farmall would cost you your farm. I was wrong. My expansion cost me my farm. Your caution saved yours. I'm sorry it happened this way, Rick. Are you? You got my land for half what I paid for it. I didn't make you borrow $578,000. Rick had no response. He left. They never spoke again. Gerald farmed until 2005, age 70, sold his 800 acres for $2,950 per acre, $2,360,000. The John Deere salesman who called him a fool lost everything. The farmer who kept the Farmall bought his farm and retired a millionaire. Sometimes the fool is the one giving advice. But the full story of those 12 years, of how Rick Benson went from confident dealer calling farmers fools to losing everything, requires more detail. Rick had inherited Benson Implement from his father in 1976. The dealership had been profitable since 1952, selling John Deere equipment to farmers across Tama County. Rick was ambitious, wanted to expand beyond just selling equipment, wanted to farm himself. In 1978, Rick bought his first farm, 160 acres for $180,000, financed at 11.2%. He was 35, confident, believed the boom would continue forever. His thinking: use dealership income to service farm debt, use farm profits to expand further. Classic leverage strategy that worked when prices were rising. In 1980, Rick bought another 160 acres for $216,000 at 13.8%. In 1982, against all logic as the crisis was starting, he bought 160 more acres for $178,000 at 15.9%. Distress sale from a failing farmer, Rick thought he was getting a bargain. By 1985, Rick owned 480 acres and owed $578,000. His combined interest rate averaged around 14.2%. Annual debt service, $89,400. At tools, 10 corn and 140 bushel average yields, he was grossing maybe $96,000 before operating costs. The math didn't work. Meanwhile, Gerald farmed his 320 acres with the 1962 Farmall 560 that Rick had mocked. Gerald's only debt was his original land payment. Bought the 320 acres in 1968 for $186,000, owed $43,000 by 1981. His payment was $940 per month, $11,280 per year. Manageable even at $2.10 corn. The years between that March 1981 confrontation and the March 1993 auction were brutal for Rick, peaceful for Gerald. 1981. Rick told multiple farmers they were fools for not upgrading equipment. Sold 18 tractors that year, made $78,000 in commissions. Felt like a genius. Gerald replaced the clutch on his Farmall, cost $127. Did it himself. 1982. Crisis fully underway. Rick's dealership sales dropped 70%. Only sold 6 tractors. Made $21,000 in commissions. His farm income also dropped. Started having trouble making land payments. Gerald paid off his land completely in August. Now owned 320 acres, free and clear. 1983. Rick laid off 2 mechanics at the dealership. Couldn't afford them. His farms were losing money, gross of $96,000 against debt service of $89,400, left almost nothing for operating costs. He was borrowing to plant. Gerald had his best year, grossed $68,000 from 320 acres, no debt service, netted $42,000. 1984. Rick missed his first land payment, 3 months behind. Bank sent warning letters. Dealership struggling, sold 3 tractors all year. Gerald bought a used 1977 International 1086 for $8,200 cash at an auction. Now had 2 tractors, both paid for. 1985. Rick was 6 months behind on multiple payments, dealership showing losses. His CPA told him he was heading for bankruptcy, suggested selling farms to discharge debt. Rick refused, believed he could weather the crisis. Gerald farmed 320 acres, saved $38,000 that year. 1986, Rick's father died, left him $45,000. Rick used it to catch up payments, bought 6 months of time, dealership still struggling. Gerald attended Rick's father's funeral, offered condolences. Rick barely acknowledged him. 1987, Rick started selling equipment from his farms to raise cash. Sold a combine for $28,000, used it for operating expenses. Dealership down to just Rick and one part-time employee. Gerald had $94,000 saved, kept farming steady. 1988, Rick's dealership closed in November. Couldn't compete anymore. Sales had dropped to almost nothing. He still owed money to John Deere for inventory. His farming operation was his only income now, and it was losing money every year. Gerald passed $130,000 in savings. 1989, Rick was 12 months behind on land payments. Bank filed foreclosure paperwork. Rick hired a lawyer, tried to fight it. Delayed the inevitable by 2 years through legal tactics. Gerald quietly farmed, saved, waited. 1990, Rick's lawyer told him he was out of options. Foreclosure was proceeding. Rick started drinking heavily. Marriage fell apart. Wife left with their 2 kids. Gerald remained steady, saved $156,000 by year-end. 1991, Rick living alone in a rental house, working odd jobs, waiting for foreclosure auction. Bitter about how things turned out. Blamed the economy, the banks, the government. Never blamed his own decisions. Gerald saved $174,000. 1992, Rick's court battle ended. Auction scheduled for March 1993. Rick had to watch his farms advertised in the newspaper. Gerald had $186,000 saved, started researching land values at auctions. March 1993, the auction. Rick attended, had to watch his life's work sell. Gerald bid $980 per acre, outbid 2 others, won all 480 acres, paid $186,000 cash down, his entire savings, financed the rest. Calculated risk. Rick left before auction ended, couldn't watch. That encounter 2 weeks later at the co-op was unavoidable in a small town. Rick saw Gerald, had to acknowledge what happened. You bought my farm. Bought the bank's farm. Same thing. Not legally. 12 years ago I told you that Farmall would cost you your farm. I remember. I was wrong. I'm man enough to admit it. Your old equipment didn't cost you anything. My expansion cost me everything. Gerald didn't gloat, didn't rub it in. Just nodded. What are you doing now? Working at the Hy-Vee, stocking shelves. 42 years old, stocking shelves. I'm sorry. Are you? You got 480 acres for half what it's worth. I got it for what the market would bear. That's not my fault. No, it's mine. I borrowed when I should have saved, expanded when I should have consolidated, told farmers like you that you were fools when I was the fool all along. They never spoke again. Rick moved to Cedar Rapids 6 months later, got a job at a warehouse, died in 2019 at age 76, never financially recovered. Left his kids nothing. Gerald farmed his 800 acres until 2005, age 70. His 1962 Farmall 560 lasted until 1998, 36 years of service, before he finally replaced it, sold the 800 acres for $2,150 per acre, $2,160,000. After paying off his remaining $84,000 in debt and taxes, netted about $2 million. The John Deere salesman who called him a fool for keeping that Farmall ended up with nothing. The farmer who kept the Farmall bought the salesman's farm and retired rich. Sometimes staying still is smarter than moving forward. Sometimes the fool is the one giving the advice. The relationship between Gerald Mitchell and Rick Benson wasn't just about that one confrontation in March 1981. It was a 12-year contrast in philosophies that played out in dozens of smaller moments. Gerald was born in 1935, grew up during the tail end of the Depression. His father had lost a farm in 1937 to debt. Gerald remembered strangers auctioning their possessions, remembered his father's shame. That memory shaped everything. When Gerald bought his 320 acres in 1968 for $186,000, he borrowed the minimum, $136,000 at 7.8%, and committed to paying it off fast. By 1982, he'd done it. 14 years to full ownership. Rick was born in 1943, grew up during the post-war boom. Never saw hard times. His father's dealership was always profitable. Rick learned that borrowing was normal, that leverage created wealth, that expansion was success. By the time he took over the dealership in 1976, those beliefs were bedrock. Their second confrontation happened in June 1982. Gerald came in for parts again, this time a water pump for the Farmall. Rick was stressed. Dealership sales were collapsing, but he still couldn't resist. "Gerald, you're still running that Farmall. It's 20 years old now. 20, still works. I've got a nice used 4040 1978 model, only 4,200 hours. I can make you a deal. 24,000. Not interested. Why not? Don't you want to grow? Don't you want to be successful?" Gerald looked at Rick carefully. "I am successful. I own my land. No debt. I'm successful. You're stagnant. Success means growth. Maybe for you, not for me." Rick found that maddening. Gerald's contentment, his lack of ambition, seemed like failure. Rick couldn't understand someone who didn't want more. Their third significant interaction was in April 1984. Gerald was at the diner in town, saw Rick sitting alone at the counter. Rick looked exhausted. Gerald sat down next to him. "How's things, Rick?" "Fine." "Obviously not fine." "Dealership?" "Slow, but we'll make it." "How are the farms?" Rick looked at Gerald, defensive. "Why do you care?" "Just asking." "They're fine. Tight, but fine." Gerald knew they weren't fine. Everyone in the county knew Rick was behind on payments. But Gerald didn't press, just nodded. "Let me know if you need anything." "I don't need anything from you." Gerald paid for his coffee, left. Rick sat there feeling angry at Gerald's pity, angry at his own situation. Their fourth interaction was at Rick's father's funeral in February 1986. Gerald attended, offered condolences. Rick's father had been a good man, had built the dealership from nothing. Rick appreciated Gerald showing up. "Thank you for coming. Your dad was a good man, honest dealer." "Yeah." "How are you holding up?" "Managing." They both knew Rick was failing, but neither said it, just stood there in mutual understanding of difficulty. Their fifth interaction was accidental. September 1988. Gerald was at the implement dealer in Iowa Falls. Benson Implement had closed 2 months earlier, and saw Rick loading his personal tools into a truck. "Rick." Rick turned, saw Gerald. "Gerald, come to see the carnage." "Came to buy parts. Didn't know you'd be here." "Just cleaning out my stuff. Dealership's officially closed." "I heard. I'm sorry." "Are you?" "Yes, I didn't want this to happen." Rick looked at him. "You know what kills me? You were right. About the Farmall. About not borrowing. About all of it. And I was wrong, and I can't fix it. Maybe not, but you can survive it." "How? I'm 45. Everything I built is gone." "Start over. Smaller. Smarter." Rick laughed bitterly. "Easy for you to say. You didn't lose everything." Gerald wanted to say, "I didn't lose everything because I didn't risk everything," but that would be cruel. So he just said, "Good luck, Rick." Their final interaction before the auction came in December 1992. Gerald was having coffee at the diner when Rick walked in. Rick had lost weight, looked older than 49. He saw Gerald, almost left, then decided to sit. "Gerald." "Rick, heard you've been saving money. Heard you've got close to 200,000. Where'd you hear that?" "Small town. People talk." Gerald didn't confirm or deny. "You going to bid on my farms?" "Haven't decided. They're good ground. Worth more than they'll sell for. Probably. If you bid, you'll probably win. Not many people have cash right now." "That's true. It'll be strange. You owning my land, me having nothing." "Rick, I didn't cause this." "I know. I caused it. Borrowed too much. Expanded too fast. Believed the boom would last. You were smarter. I was luckier. Born earlier. Saw what debt does. You didn't see that." "Maybe." Rick stood up. "If you buy my farms, take care of them. Good ground. Deserves better than I gave it." March 1993. The auction. Gerald bid carefully, strategically. Won at $980 per acre, paid his entire savings as down payment. Financed $284,400 at 7.2%, much better rate than Rick had ever had, because the crisis was ending and Gerald's credit was perfect. That confrontation 2 weeks later at the co-op was the last time they spoke. Rick moved to Cedar Rapids, worked warehouse jobs, remarried in 2001 to a woman who didn't know his history. Never told his new family he'd once owned farms and a dealership. Just let them think he'd always been working class. Rick died in 2019 at 76. Heart attack. His obituary mentioned he'd worked at Menard's distribution center for 18 years. Didn't mention the dealership or the farms or the failure. His kids from his first marriage didn't attend the funeral. His second wife buried him with the small life insurance policy that was his only asset. Gerald farmed until 2005, 70 years old, ready to retire, sold his 800 acres, his original 320 plus Rick's 480, for $2,950 per acre, total $2,360,000. After paying off remaining debt and capital gains taxes, netted about $2,000. Gerald retired to a modest home in Iowa City, lived comfortably. Died in 2022 at 87, left his estate to his 3 daughters, approximately $1.8 million split 3 ways. At Gerald's funeral, his daughter Emma told the story. Dad had this old Farmall tractor, 1962 model. A dealership owner once told him he was a fool for keeping it, told him it would cost him his farm. 12 years later, Dad bought that man's farm at auction. Dad kept that Farmall until 1998. 36 years. Never cost him anything but maintenance. The man who called him a fool lost everything. Dad died a millionaire. Someone asked, "Was your dad angry at the dealer? Did he hold a grudge?" Emma thought. No. Dad felt sorry for him. Said the dealer was just unlucky with timing and overconfident in prosperity. Said it could have happened to anyone who believed the boom would last. Dad was lucky he'd been born early enough to see the Depression, to learn caution from his father's failure. The dealer never saw hard times until it was too late. That's probably true. Rick Benson wasn't evil or stupid. He was just overconfident. Believed in the agricultural boom, believed in leverage, believed his luck would hold. When it didn't, he lost everything. Gerald Mitchell wasn't a genius. He was just cautious. Kept his old tractor, avoided debt, lived simply. When the crisis came, he survived. When the auction happened, he had cash. The Deere Salesman called him a fool for keeping that Farmall. 12 years later, he bought the salesman's farm. Sometimes caution beats ambition. Sometimes the old equipment outlasts the new debt. Sometimes the fool is the one giving advice. The contrast between Gerald and Rick wasn't just about farming philosophy. It was about life philosophy. Gerald understood that enough was enough. Rick never learned that lesson. Gerald's financial records from 1981 to 1993 tell the story of discipline. His annual gross income from 320 acres ranged from $52,000 in bad years to $74,000 in good years. His living expenses averaged $18,000 per year. He lived in a modest house, drove a 12-year-old pickup, took no vacations, spent nothing on luxuries. Everything extra went to savings. By 1982, when he paid off his land, his only expenses were operating costs, property taxes, and living expenses. No debt service. That freed up $11,280 per year that his neighbors were paying to banks. Over 11 years from 1982 to 1993, that was $124,080, not paid in interest, plus the principal he'd already paid off early. Gerald's debt avoidance saved him well over $200,000. Rick's records, pulled from bankruptcy filings, show the opposite pattern. His gross income from the dealership and farms combined ranged from $220,000 in 1980 to $65,000 in 1987. But his debt service was $89,400 per year on the farms alone, plus dealership overhead, plus personal spending. Rick lived in a large house, drove new vehicles, took his family on vacations. When times were good, he spent. When times were bad, he borrowed to maintain lifestyle. The tragedy was, Rick could have survived. If he'd sold the farms in 1983, he would have lost money, but avoided complete ruin. Land was still worth $1,100 per acre in 1983. His 480 acres, worth $480,528,000, could have paid off most of his $578,000 debt. He'd have taken a loss, but kept the dealership, kept his house, restarted. But Rick believed the crisis would end quickly, believed land values would recover, believed he could outlast the bad times. That belief, that conviction that things would get better, cost him everything. Gerald never believed in better times. He assumed the worst, planned for it, survived because he was ready for things to stay bad forever. The auction in March 1993 was well attended. Maybe 60 people, some legitimate bidders, some just watching. Rick stood in the back, watching his life's work get sold. The auctioneer described the farms. 480 acres total, good soil, tile drained, excellent productivity, being sold as one parcel or 3 separate parcels at buyer's option. Gerald had decided to bid on all 480 as one parcel, easier to manage, better price per acre that way. Bidding started at $800 per acre, quickly went to $900, then $950. Gerald bid $960. Another bidder went $970, Gerald went $980, silence. Going once, twice, sold to Gerald Mitchell for $470, $400. Rick left before the paperwork was completed, couldn't watch. Drove back to his rental house, sat alone, understood his life had fundamentally changed. Everything he'd built was gone. He was starting over at 49 with nothing. Gerald completed the paperwork, paid $186,000 cash down, every penny he'd saved, financed $285,400 at 7.2% over 15 years. Monthly payment, $2,564. High, but manageable. He was 57, figured he'd farm another 10 to 15 years, pay it off or pay it down substantially. The first year farming Rick's land, 1993, was strange for Gerald. These were fields Rick had farmed, had borrowed against, had lost. Gerald walked them, felt the history. Good ground. Rick had been right about that. The land itself wasn't the problem. The debt had been the problem. Gerald farmed all 800 acres carefully, used his 2 tractors, the 1962 Farmall 560 and the 1977 International 1086. Both paid for, both maintained meticulously. Neighbors sometimes commented that Gerald was farming 800 acres with equipment others wouldn't use for 200 acres. But it worked. His costs were minimal. No equipment payments. Just fuel, seed, fertilizer, chemicals, and the land payment. He grossed about $224,000 from 800 acres in good years, netted $80,000, $90,000 after all expenses, including debt service. More than enough. By 1998, Gerald was 63. The 1962 Farmall was 36 years old, finally wore out beyond practical repair. Engine was burning oil, transmission was slipping, hydraulics were weak. Gerald could have rebuilt everything, but it would cost $8,000, $10,000. Not worth it. He bought a used 1988 John Deere 2955 for $18,500. Ironic, finally bought a John Deere from a different dealer. 12 years after Rick Benson had called him a fool for not buying new. Gerald farmed until 2005. By then he was 70, ready to retire. His daughter Emma and her husband had no interest in farming. Neither did his other 2 daughters. Gerald decided to sell, listed the 800 acres in March 2005, got multiple offers. Land was hot, values had recovered fully, were at all-time highs. Best offer, $2,950 per acre from a young farmer who'd been saving for years. Gerald accepted. Total sale, $2,360,000. He owed about $84,000 remaining on the original loan. After paying that off, before taxes, he had $2,276,000. After capital gains taxes at about 15%, he netted roughly $2,000. 43 years of farming. Started with $50,000 down payment in 1968, ended with $2,000 in 2005. Never borrowed more than he could service. Never spent more than he needed. Never chased growth for growth's sake. Rick Benson, who'd started with a profitable dealership and expanded to 480 acres, ended with nothing. The man who called Gerald a fool for keeping an old Farmall lost everything to debt, while the man with the old Farmall bought his farm and retired a millionaire. At Gerald's funeral in 2022, over 200 people attended. He'd been respected in the community, known for his quiet wisdom. The pastor told the story of Rick and Gerald, the dealer and the farmer, the confrontation in 1981, the auction in 1993, the different outcomes. Gerald Mitchell understood something many people never learn, that peace of mind is more valuable than growth, that enough is enough, that old equipment maintained carefully beats new equipment bought on credit. Rick Benson learned these lessons too late. Gerald learned them from his father's failure in the Depression and never forgot. Someone asked Emma after the funeral, "Did your dad ever regret not expanding, not growing more?" Emma smiled. "I asked him that once, when I was in college. Asked if he ever wished he'd been more ambitious. You know what he said? 'I had everything I needed. 320 acres was enough to feed my family and save money. 800 acres was more than enough to retire rich. Why would I need more?' That was Dad. Enough was always enough." The John Deere salesman called him a fool for keeping that Farmall. 12 years later, he bought the salesman's farm. The old tractor outlasted the new debt. The quiet farmer outlasted the confident dealer. Sometimes the fool is the one who thinks they know everything. Sometimes wisdom looks like stubbornness until time proves who was right.